Well, the U.S. Coast Guard is a fairly broad topic. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to give you a presentation today about the United States of America. And in preparing this, I attempted to kind of narrow it down. So you see my title, as I put on this slide, says Roots and Fruits, because I wanted to kind of focus a little bit about where the Coast Guard came from. But I also wanted to, on this Coast Guard Day, kind of talk about where the Coast Guard is today. So let's get started. Coast Guard is the oldest continuously operating sea service in the United States. You notice we carefully don't say the oldest because obviously the Navy was around and the Marines during the Revolutionary War. But at the end of that war, the frugal Congress basically disbanded the Navy and the Marines. And the Revenue Cutter Service, which is the primary forebearer of the Coast Guard, was established on August 4th, 1790. And from then, for the next 9 years until the US Navy was reestablished, the Coast Guard was the only armed seagoing service of the United States. The Coast Guard is unique among all the armed services because it is also a federal law enforcement agency. All right, so let's go back to the roots. George Washington took office in April of 1789, and at that time, he was taking the reins of a nation which had no organization, no structure, no government, except him, basically. And in his hands, he held about $80 million of debt, which was that of the preceding government, plus the US government assumed all of the state debts from the Revolution. So that was a whole bunch of debt and no income. So one of the first things the Congress did, the first Congress, was pass the Revenue Act in 1789, which authorized tariffs on imports. Anything coming from overseas would be taxed. And thereafter, one of the next laws passed, August 9th of 1789, authorized the establishment of the U.S. Lighthouse establishment. As it says here, to provide safety of coastal shipping. Now, I bring that up because Coast Guard traces its roots to August 4th of 1790, but one of the elements that's in modern Coast Guard finds its roots in the Lighthouse service. So we could actually go back to August 9th of 1789 to find the earliest seeds of the Coast Guard. We see on here, it says that was to provide safety of coastal shipping. It's interesting that early, the government of the United States of America was assuming a very broad responsibility. And of course, they were interested in safety of the coastal shipping because the coastal shipping was bringing the goods on which the tariff was going to be imposed. Having established the fact that we're going to collect money, somebody decided, oh, we better have a Treasury Department. So on September 2nd, 1789, the United States Treasury Department was established. Well, who was in charge? This guy, Alexander Hamilton. He was 34 at the time. He was young. He was appointed Secretary of the Treasury 1 week after the position was established. He, like Washington, inherited a job with no precedent, no structure, no organization. But he was a smart young feller, and he realized we're broke, and so I can't spend a lot of money. Well, how did he get started? Americans throughout the Revolutionary War were very good at smuggling past the British. And for a century or more before that, they had established themselves quite well as smuggling. It was basically an honorable profession. Hamilton realized he needed to stop it. He proposed that we have a fleet of cutters to enforce the tariff laws. Well, that was before there was even an organization to encompass those. But on August 4th, 1790, Congress authorized 10 cutters and 40 officers. That was 10 officers for each cutter. And it also authorized 6 men, that would be 4 sailors and 2 boys for each cutter. And these cutters were to be built at a cost of $1,000 apiece. Oh, okay, what's a cutter? Well, historically, a cutter was a single-masted decked sailing vessel, you see here, designed for speed rather than capacity. In other words, it was a swift boat. It had a deck to make it seaworthy, distinguished from a sloop, which was a similar boat, by the fact that it had 2 or more head sails. Those are the ones out in front, the kind of triangular ones, and a bowsprit, the pointy thing in front of some length to stretch those head sails out. The mast was gaff rigged. That's the kind of diagonal thing you see 3/4 of the way up the main sail and set further back. and they sometimes carried a topsail. We'll get to that one. But they were typically used by harbor pilots and privateers, military dispatch vessels, and racing yachts. Why? Because they were fast. And in fact, cutters were what were used primarily by the British for their customs collections. Oh yeah, okay. Well, if you know something about the Coast Guard, you realize that the cutters that we have today don't look quite like that. But once the term was applied to the boats, the first boats of the revenue cutter service, it's remained in use ever since. And today it's used for all commissioned Coast Guard vessels over 65 feet in length. Any smaller boats like the one on the right in the bottom of the picture, a 47-foot motor lifeboat, would be referred to by their hull number. So what do we call this organization? Well, the act that authorized the first 10 cutters kind of had a small oversight. It didn't bother to say what organization they belonged to. Generally, at first, it was referred to as the system of cutters. Gradually, it became known as the Revenue Service and subsequently the Revenue Marine. And finally, in 1863, it got an official name through Act of Congress. It became the Revenue Cutter Service, United States Revenue Cutter Service. And through the years, before it was officially designated as such and after, it constantly was accumulating new missions because there seemed to be nobody else around to do those jobs. Anything relating to enforcement of laws in the maritime environment. The Revenue Cutter Service continued to grow until finally in 1915, it was merged with the Lighthouse Service. You remember them from 1789, and it was given the name the United States Coast Guard. So who's in charge at this point? Hamilton had to create the Treasury Department from scratch. He didn't have much money. The management of the cutters ultimately got delegated largely to the customs collectors in each major port. On the right, we see a picture of Benjamin Lincoln, who was the customs collector in Boston. You may, if you're a student of the Revolution, recognize his name. He was a very successful general in the Revolution. He was Washington's second command at Yorktown, and it was he who accepted the surrender of Cornwallis's army. Why do I mention all this? Well, obviously, he's a man of some reputation. The customs collectors were all people with very powerful backgrounds, and they had a lot of influence over the initial shaping of the Coast Guard or the Revenue Cutter Service, because for the first 50 years or so of the Coast Guard's history, there was rarely any real central management. So who were these customs collectors? Well, again, men of distinction and power. These are the four whose pictures, besides Benjamin Lincoln, I happen to be able to find. We have Colonel Whipple of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a local Revolutionary War hero. Jedediah Huntington of New London, Connecticut, obviously a successful Revolutionary War patriot. Colonel Sharp Delaney of Philadelphia, and Major John Haversham of Savannah, Georgia. Now, Sharp Delaney, you see, I got a little asterisk by him because he is frequently referred to as the father of the Coast Guard. He was a customs collector in 1789, and he immediately recognized that he was going to have trouble collecting customs if he couldn't somehow control those who are carrying the goods. So he, on his own hook, acquired or hired a sailing vessel and crew and used that to intercept incoming traffic and collect the customs. It's what he felt he had to do in the absence of any other cutters provided by the government. And by this act and by correspondence he had with Hamilton saying, hey, we got to do something about this, again, he had a very strong influence on the creation of the Revenue Cutter Service and thus the Coast Guard. Well, Hamilton proposed 10 revenue boats to enforce the customs laws, 2 for Massachusetts and New Hampshire, 1 for Long Island Sound, 1 for New York, 1 for the Bay of Delaware, in other words, Philadelphia, basically, 2 for the Chesapeake, that would be 1 in Baltimore and 1 in Norfolk. And these fine boats would not only have the Chesapeake Bay, but also, of course, they would ply the coasts of Virginia and North Carolina. And finally, 1 for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Hamilton figured that these boats would be 36 to 40 feet on the keel, to be built at a cost of $1,000 each. The boats that eventually got built were somewhat bigger and noticeably more expensive. But as I note on the bottom, from the very beginning, everybody was calling these cutters. And again, probably because that was the common term for British Customs Collections boats, not too surprising. Hamilton, excuse me, Hamilton arranged for each cutter to receive 10 muskets with bayonets, 10 pistols, 2 chisels, and 1 broadaxe. I'm not sure what they were supposed to do with the chisels, but we have 20 weapons for a crew of 10 people. So basically everybody's going to have a musket and a pistol. And some of these cutters, probably on the initiative of the local customs collectors and maybe funded by the local merchant community, were also equipped with small swivel guns. These would be mounted on the rail of the ship and could be aimed and loaded and managed by 1 sailor, but in essence, mini cannons. Well, we're going to get some cutters, we need some officers. Hamilton had some strong words, which are still taught at the Coast Guard Academy today. He said, well, I recommend in the strongest terms to the respective officers, activity, vigilance, and firmness. Their deportment must be marked with prudence, moderation, and good temper. In other words, we're talking tact. Tact was not always a common attribute among sailors in those days. Upon these qualities must depend the success and continuance of the organization. He realized right away that if people found the revenue cutter service offensive, oppressive, that there would be strong pressure to just do away with it. They will always keep in mind that their countrymen are free men and as such are impatient of everything that bears the least mark of domineering spirit. They will attempt to, the cutter captains, will attempt to overcome difficulties by a cool and temperate perseverance in their duty, rather than by vehemence and violence. That's a fairly strong set of orders as to how he was going to screen the people for the job. Initially, there was going to be a master and 3 mates on each cutter. That was the standard officer manning for merchant vessels. In 1799, these ranks were replaced by captain, first, second, and third lieutenant to clearly delineate the military character of the service. And that act in 1799 also said that the cutters would operate under the Navy, direction of the Navy Department, which had just been created at that time, when so directed by the president. And thus, as every fledgling Coast Guard officer learns early in his training, the Coast Guard is that hardcore around which the Navy forms in time of war. All right, so we're going to get some captains. Well, 10 were picked. Washington solicited information, recommendations from the customs collectors and other powerful people in each port, screened through them and picked 7 from those lists. And their commissions were signed on March 11th of 1791. The first of those being Hopley Yeaton from New Hampshire, who's considered the first officer in the Coast Guard, pretty much only because the list of the first 7 commissions which Washington signed was put on his desk in geographical order from north to south. But we see 7 officers there on March 11th, April 25th, May 8th, May 20th. The reason these came later was because Washington himself traveled to North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to see for himself who the best candidates might be. And as he selected them, he signed their commissions. Now, the picture on the left side is Hopley Yeaton, maybe. I think that's from a 20th century painting and is based on somebody's idea of what Hopley Yeaton ought to have looked like. The picture on the right is Captain James Montgomery. To my knowledge, that's the only verified picture of any of the first 10 revenue cutter captains. Well, now we've got 10 captains. I think I got a slide out of order. Aha, okay, good. We're going to have 10 captains. We need 10 cutters. Well, the first of these, the Scammell, built in New Hampshire. I would point out each of these cutters was built in the port out of which it was going to operate as a, not sure what I should call that. We might call them pork, but it was a kind of a way of giving the local people ownership of these cutters. The Scammell, which was originally named Ferret, they got underway on their first cruise and discovered that there was a British ship operating the area named Ferret. That was kind of unacceptable, so they quickly changed it to Scammell after a local Revolutionary War hero. This was a two-masted schooner, 57 feet long, went to Hopley-Eaton. The second, the Massachusetts, was again a schooner with an Indian figurehead. It had some very fine carvings on it. It was 60 feet long. It was the biggest of the first 10 cutters. In fact, it was so big that it had about 150% cost overrun. Everybody involved, except the captain, was very upset with that, and they made an agreement with the builder that the builder would be given back the first Massachusetts as soon as he could deliver a more proper-sized second Massachusetts, which was done about a year and a half later. The Delaware, a schooner, probably about 48 feet long, and Virginia, a schooner. This was 40 feet straight rabbit. Everybody knows what that means, of course. No, I had to look it up. That's the measurement on the keel, which means this too was about a 48-foot schooner. Diligence, another schooner, about 48 feet, may have had 4 swivel guns. South Carolina, another schooner, definitely had 4 swivel guns. And the Eagle, which was a schooner, around 50 to 55 feet. So these were the first 10 cutters. Okay, so these are cutters. As you can see, however, none of the first 10 cutters was technically a cutter. We have a picture of a cutter on the top right. What these were mostly topsail schooners, shown on the bottom right. That has kind of the bottom half of the rigging on that as a typical schooner, but it also had square rigged sails on the upper portions of the mast. So in fact, the Coast Guard has never had a true cutter. But as you see on the bottom, if you have friends who are in the Coast Guard, please do not try to tell this to somebody who's worked very hard to earn the cutterman's insignia, which is shown there. All right, so moving forward, as the new nation was spreading its wings, they soon realized that there were threats from abroad, possibly from the British, possibly from the French, neither one of which was at that time very friendly toward the new nation. So they decided, you know what, maybe we need to have a Navy or something. So Congress authorized the president to acquire 6 frigates, 4 of 44 guns, 2 with 36. The acquisition ended up being a building program, which resulted in the first 6 frigates of the Navy in 1798 and 99. In the meantime, they increased the cutters from 10 men to not exceeding 30. And the law specifically empowered the president to cause the said revenue cutters to defend the seacoast. We don't have a Navy, so who's going to do it? Why, these mighty revenue cutters, and repel any hostility to their vessels and commerce within their jurisdiction, of course, having due regard for the duty of said cutters and the protection of the revenue. You know, you're going to fight off the enemy unless, of course, you have to collect some money. Well, at that time, they also decided it would be helpful to have a distinctive emblem for the revenue cutters, so people seeing them coming would know exactly what they were. They wanted to have something that would be universally recognized, so they came up with the revenue cutter ensign, the upper left being the one from 1799. I find it interesting that once they had developed something that would be universally recognized, the design was actually changed 6 times. We see a relative sampling of them. They're not that different, however. Well, at that point, with war with France imminent, the next generation of Coast Guard or revenue cutters were authorized and built. And these were all bigger, mostly topsail schooners, bigger so that they can carry more men and very necessarily more guns. These were Baltimore Clipper types, which was also sometimes referred to as jackass brigs, nice term. But in any case, the biggest of these, the Pickering, carried about 90 men and 14 guns. The rest of them carried 50 to 70 men, 10 to 14 guns each. And again, we have mostly schooners, but also at least 1 sloop among them. And again, no cutters. 1798 to 1801, we find ourselves in a little-known conflict called the Quasi-War with France. Basically, the French had become intolerable. This was the time at which Napoleon was coming into power. During the Quasi-War with France, the revenue cutters captured 21 French ships. And of those, the second Eagle captured 10, in addition to recovering 4 previously captured American prizes. But in any case, at the end of that war, the Revenue Cutter Service found itself at the highest point it would probably be for 50 years. They had 17 well-armed, well-manned vessels, and many experienced officers and men. Well, moving forward, kind of more of the same. These ships, when they were built, generally had a life of 6 to 10 years. They were wooden ships in a time when wood was prone to corrosion, rot. The sails wore out. So 1807, the Secretary of the Treasury urgently requested new cutters. He said, my fleet's falling apart. The revenue is threatened. And so acting swiftly, Congress 2 years later authorized 12 new cutters. These were to be fast sailors armed with 6 to 10 4-pounders, long guns, plus, if possible, 12-pounder carronades. These were shorter guns designed for broadside firing at point-blank range, which was the typical vision of naval warfare in those days. And at the beginning of the War of 1812, there were 15 or 16 cutters in service. And as I kind of go through the list of these, you'll notice that some of these, as I said, they didn't have a long life, were already in their umpteenth iteration. The 3rd Massachusetts, the 3rd Argus, the 4th Diligence, the cutter service, and later the Coast Guard tended to use names over and over again, especially those that had honorable service. We have the 5th General Green, the Commodore Barry, the Active, which wasn't the first, but I don't know what it was, the 4th Eagle, Gallatin, Jefferson Hornet, Louisiana Madison, New Hampshire Surveyor, and Vigilant, which also was not the first of its name. But this was a pretty good fleet. Again, very capable, swift sailing ships, very seaworthy, with experienced crews. Come to the War of 1812. By this time, the Navy had begun to really establish itself. It had been in existence now for over a decade, had time to build up their fleet and train their officers and crews. The Revenue Cutter Service did operate with the Navy under orders of the President. And in fact, the cutter Jefferson was the first US vessel to capture a British prize. In June of 1812, they captured the British brig Patriot, a much bigger ship than they were. The War of 1812 was marked more with heroic events than with great successes as far as the Revenue Cutter Service was concerned. But a couple of those, June 12, 1813, the Surveyor, a very small cutter with 16 men, was anchored in the York River. The captain had put out a small boat with sentries because he knew there were larger British ships operating in the area. And in fact, one of those ships came into the area in the fog. They launched 5 longboats filled with British sailors and attempted to sneak up on the Surveyor, but their sentries detected them before they arrived. The captain quietly gave each man in the crew 2 muskets. And as the British sailors approached, they gave them everything they had. Eventually, the crew was overcome by the British. But afterwards, the captain of the British ship presented the captain of Surveyor back his sword, saying that this was one of the most best fought, most honorable defenses that he'd ever seen. August 11th, 1814, the Eagle, now the 3rd one, versus just about everyone. They had been very successful in recapturing prizes that the British had taken from the Americans, and they sailed out one day in search of a 30-gun British ship, which had been capturing things. Now, they didn't intend to take on that British ship, but they hoped to be able to recapture some of the prizes, being themselves in a smaller, faster vessel. As it turns out, as they were heading out, they were encountered by not the ship they were looking for, but a smaller ship with 16 guns plus 2 other ships with more guns. So there were about 20, 25 substantial guns against their very small ship. Their ship, in fact, had 6 guns, 2 or 4 4-pounders that would shoot something about the size of a baseball, and 2 2-pounders, which would shoot, I don't know, billiard balls probably. These were very small guns. They were quickly driven up on the beach, and they, having gone out initially looking for trouble, they had previously loaded themselves with extra crew members. They had added about 40 local people from the port where they sailed from. And when they were driven up from the beach, local militiamen joined them. But with their ship on the ground, they hauled their 6 cannons to the top of a 140-foot bluff, and leaving a number of people with muskets on the ship to keep the British from getting too close. They ultimately ended up, the British at another point were joined by another ship, doubling the amount of cannons they had shooting. The Americans, from the top of their bluff, shot away all of their ammunition. They then proceeded to dig British cannonballs out of the cliffside, out of the dirt around them, the ones that were small enough to be reused. They loaded those, and for wadding in the gun, they were running out of material. They actually crumpled up the pages of their logbook so that they could keep on shooting. Ultimately, they ran out of ammunition. They couldn't stop the British. They retreated. No Americans were captured, but it was considered to be a rather honorable fight in that they held onto their ship for 3 days. Well, 1830s to 1850s, the revenue cutter service continued to periodically replace its ship, primarily with the traditional now topsail schooners. By 1832, there was a new problem. 1 out of 7 American steamships exploded that year. That wasn't a very good record. And many of these being passenger carrying, if you were to go to buy a ticket on one of those steamships, the ticket agent would offer you the opportunity to buy a newly invented life jacket. That gives you an idea, you know, I'm going to let you have a ticket on the airplane. You want to buy a parachute? That's really encouraging. In 1838, the first federal steamship inspection laws were brought into effect, and the Treasury Department enforced those. But in fact, a lot of that work initially was done by the Revenue Cutter Service. Early 1840s, the Revenue Cutter Service finally comes into the modern age. They got 8 iron steamers. 4 of these had hunter wheels. Now, this was a highly experimental thing. The Revenue Cutter Service was the guinea pig. They were paddle wheels, basically mounted 1 on each side under the stern of the ship, side by side, sideways. So if you think about how a paddle wheel works by grabbing the water, these were grabbing the water and pushing the ship forward, and grabbing the water and pushing the ship backward. Under the absolute best circumstances, these ships could make about 4 knots. They were absolutely worthless, and the sailing suite that was left on them was very insufficient compared to the earlier topsail schooners. And as a result, basically all 8 of these vessels were close to worthless. The Mexican War, 1846 to 1848, was largely a land war. The Coast Guard cooperated with the Navy in providing landing services for amphibious operations, logistics support, communications. But after that war, that was basically the lowest of the low points in the Revenue Cutter Service. They had about 5 operable cutters left, and there wasn't a whole lot of interest in beefing up the service. After a few years, though, the Revenue Cutter Service began to get attention because they were having trouble collecting the revenues. And in 1859, we have the Revenue Cutter Harriet Lane. And the Harriet Lane, you can see in this picture, was a side wheel, paddle wheel steamer. It had as much of the traditional topsail schooner rig as could fit around the smokestack left. But it was a very, very good ship. As a matter of fact, the Navy kind of envied this ship. But that brings us to the Civil War. The Revenue Cutter Service very thoughtfully provided pretty much the first 5 ships of the Confederate Navy. Revenue cutters in a number of southern ports were seized. In one port, the captain of the ship tried to defend it himself, but couldn't, and he ended up giving the cutter to the local government, and he and his entire crew marched north. I think he was in New Orleans. He marched back to the north where they were assigned to new different cutters. Another one, the captain decided that he was going to give the ship to local people because he sympathized with the Southern cause. When this word got to the north that this was happening, a telegram was sent to the executive officer of the ship saying, "Arrest the captain. You are now in command. Disregard everything he says and sail that ship out of there and up north." Unfortunately, he too was a Confederate sympathizer, so that never happened. But again, 5 revenue cutters were seized by the Confederates, shrinking the fleet. The revenue cutter Harriet Lane actually was the ship that fired the first naval shot of the Civil War. She was part of the force that was sent to relieve Fort Sumter. And while they were there, an unidentified sailing ship attempted to pass them. She fired a shot across the bow, whereupon they promptly, rightly or wrongly, raised the US flag. And that was that. But nonetheless, that was the first naval shot of the Civil War. And she continued to serve well. She was in fact involved in the bombardment of some of the Confederate batteries that were being built locally here around Hampton Roads at the beginning of the war. Ultimately, she was captured by the Confederates, became a Confederate naval ship. The revenue cutter Morris, shown on the top on the right, view from the deck of the Morris, interdicted the Benjamin Adams, which was a British ship, which turned out to be carrying 650 illegal immigrants. And this was the first case I know of basically the Coast Guard or its antecedents performing another mission, which became significant at later times. The revenue cutter Miami is sometimes called the first presidential yacht. Lincoln was very fond of this ship. He used it a number of times as basically his command ship when he went into forward areas of the battle of the combat theater. When he was in Hampton Roads, shortly after the Battle of Hampton Roads, Monitor in Virginia, he used the Miami to transport him back and forth between Fort Monroe and the south side of the harbor, where he did some reconnaissance and said, I don't understand why the Army isn't over here in force. And 3 days later, the Navy and revenue cutters conveyed a large force of Union sailors across, and they then, following Abraham Lincoln's personal reconnaissance, captured Norfolk and Portsmouth. Now, the revenue cutter Naugatuck is one of my favorite ships of all times. It was built to demonstrate some principles of some people that had been trying to build an ironclad since the 1840s. It was about 100 feet long. It was a former canal boat that was converted. You see it on the bottom right. It's not a very pretty boat, but it had an armored bulwark and it could raise and lower itself in the water 3 or 4 feet by pumping water on and off. And it could do this fairly quickly. And the gun that you see up near the bow actually could be retracted down below the armor belt so the crew could load it safely, and then it could be taken up and fired without anybody exposing themselves. It performed some very good duties in the Civil War, and in fact remained as a revenue cutter until the 1880s in North Carolina. Well, let's talk about the U.S. Life-Saving Service. There was a long history of people on the coast coming to assist those in distress. That was kind of a universal fact of life. In Massachusetts, I think it was called the Massachusetts Humane Society, was founded in the 1700s to provide stations and boats where local people could quickly muster and go to the rescue. But the United States really did not have any life-saving services as a federal government. In 1848, a law came along that allowed for the funding of unmanned shore stations. That's kind of interesting. We're going to rescue people with unmanned stations. But what this was a series of buildings to be built initially along the New Jersey shore, which would contain a boat and the necessary rescue equipment. And then basically the local volunteer fire department would come, man the boat, and go to the rescue assistance. It didn't work very well. And after about 20 years, the equipment was largely neglected, sometimes missing. And finally, in 1871, funding was provided for full-time keepers and crews, and new stations were added, first in New Jersey, and then up and down the coast, the east coast of the United States. Finally, in 1871, the U.S. Life-Saving Station was formally organized to give all of this a central administration in the Treasury Department. Now, along the way, the Revenue Cutter Service had been delegated the responsibility on several different occasions for supervising and maintaining these, but it was never at that time an official duty. Well, in 1899, we have the Life-Saving Service regulation. It says, in attempting a rescue, the keeper will not desist from his efforts until by actual trial. You're not allowed to say it was too rough to go out. You have to go out to prove that it's too rough to go out. The impossibility of effecting a rescue is demonstrated by actual trial. And out of this grows the kind of informal motto of the Coast Guard: you have to go out, you don't have to come back. Well, Alaska, 1867, Seward's Folly, the United States acquired a whole bunch of territory. And at that time, about the only known revenue source until the gold rushes of the 1890s was seal furs. In 1867, that says the Coast Guard revenue cutter became the federal government's agent in Alaska. Actually, that's not true. The Army was charged with representing the federal government in Alaska, but that proved to be disastrous. So in about 1872, the Revenue Cutter Service was given that responsibility, and they carried it out with vigor. We see a picture on the bottom left of the Revenue Cutter Bear. This was an ice-strengthened ship. It was actually built for sealing, and its captain for many years was Roaring Mike Healy, who happens to be the first African-American ever to have command of a United States vessel. But he was a legend. He accomplished many things. At one point, the Bear was called upon to rescue a number of whaling ships that were besieged in the ice in the Bering Sea. They couldn't get there, so they sent a shore party who rounded up 300 and some reindeer, and they drove those reindeer overland for several hundred miles, and that managed to feed the stranded ships until such time as they were able to get out of the ice. Well, the sealing regulations, because of that, the Revenue Cutter Service had a ship during the sealing season every year. Two of those were actually named the Rush, one after the other. And so it became common knowledge that if you were going to be a seal poacher, you had to get there early to avoid the rush. And just incidentally, on the bottom right of this picture is a figurehead from that Revenue Cutter Bear, the Mighty Bear, which served first as a sealing ship, later as a Coast Guard cutter, and ultimately as Admiral Byrd's ship and his Arctic or Antarctic adventures. But that's the figurehead from the Bear, and we have that here in our collection at the Mariners Museum. So please come visit us sometime. All right, well, the Spanish-American War. In the spring of 1798, there was a problem. The Spanish had three fleets. They had one in the Philippines, they had one in the Caribbean, and they had the home fleet in Spain. And there were concerns about protecting the United States coast against attacks. The United States Navy had the Asiatic Squadron under Admiral Dewey to meet the Spanish there. They had a similar squadron in the Caribbean, and they had what was called the Flying Squadron. And they were basically sent out all over the place, seeking out the Spanish home fleet, hoping to catch them and destroy them before they could get here. Unfortunately, people began to realize, what if they don't succeed? That would lay the east coast of the US open to depredations by the Spanish, to perhaps a disastrous scope. So the Navy assigned a fellow by the name of Commander Horace Elmer, distinguished looking gentleman seen here on the right, who just happens to be my great-grandfather, to organize the available forces for what would eventually become known as Homeland Defense. Not then, but the resources that he was gathering included the Revenue Cutter Service, the Lighthouse establishment. He had been a lighthouse inspector, and he well knew that they had a number of very able ships. The lighthouses themselves provided fine coastal lookout stations, and the life-saving service, which had smaller boats, but again, a network of lookouts, along with naval militia, Army, Coast Artillery, and various civilian resources. But basically, this man, my grandfather or great-grandfather, was the first person to look at the services that today are the core of the Coast Guard and say, I'm going to bring these together into a coherent organization to protect the coasts of the United States of America. Well, during the Spanish-American War, that threat never really came to fruit, but the cutter service was very much involved in that war. We see the Revenue Cutter McCulloch, which was with Admiral Dewey at Manila Bay. This ship, because of its speed and seaworthiness, was used as a dispatch vessel in addition to one of the combatants in the battle, but it was the McCulloch that carried the word of the victory of Admiral Dewey at Manila Bay to the nearest telegraph station in Hong Kong. So it was by them that the world learned about that battle. We see the Revenue Cutter Hudson, seen here in Cardenas Bay in Cuba. And the Hudson was with two American gunboats attempting to go into the local harbor and sink two Cuban or Spanish gunboats that had been harassing the US fleet. And in the course of doing that, one of those vessels, the Winslow, was disabled. The Hudson against substantial enemy fire, steamed in close. The Hudson, incidentally, to interrupt myself, was the first steel-hulled vessel of the Revenue Cutter Service, and she had the first triple expansion engine. So she had a very reliable engine, a very sturdy hull, but she steamed in, took the Hudson under tow, and saved the Hudson and all of their crew. In the course of that battle, Congress authorized, or after that, Congress authorized for the officers a gold medal, and for everybody in the crew, a silver or bronze medal. And there were 2 crewmen among the Hudson who ended up being the first African Americans to receive awards from the US government for valor in naval actions. Well, after that, a few years later, radio came into being, and it was gradually adopted on ships. And the first radio-assisted rescue happened on January 23rd, 1909, the White Star liner Republic, seen on the lower right, kind of a precursor of that ship that once bumped into an iceberg. Same company, they all ended in IC, Titanic, Republic. It was struck by the Florida in a thick fog, kind of on the Newfoundland banks, and the radio operator immediately broadcast CQD, which stands for Come Quick Disaster. That was a signal that the company had agreed upon to be used in just such a circumstance. Later, they was to be replaced by SOS, which is a nice symmetrical, easy to remember 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. But in any case, they broadcast the CQD. The cutter Gresham responded, and eventually all aboard the Republic were rescued. So that's the first radio-assisted rescue in which the Revenue Cutter Service played a significant role. Well, about this time, it's time for the Coast Guard to take flight. You remember that there were some guys that flew a little airplane off of a hill in North Carolina, Wright brothers, and the Kill Devil Hills Life-Saving Station in December was kind of a slow season. 3 members of the life-saving service crew actually helped the Wright brothers transport supplies, launch their airplanes. And one of them actually took the first photograph of an airplane in flight during the longest flight of the Wright brothers' first plane. In any case, with that as kind of a sense of what was to come, in August 29th of 1916, the Naval Appropriations Act approved 10 Coast Guard air stations. And on March 22nd of the next year, 2 Coast Guard officers, including 3rd Lieutenant Elmer Stone, graduated from the Naval Training Center in Pensacola. Elmer Stone thus becoming Coast Guard Aviator #1 and Naval Aviator #38. He went on to a very distinguished career in and after World War I. May 8th through the 27th, 1919, Elmer Stone was the pilot of the NC-4, which was a seaplane, 1 of 4 that left the United States to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and the only one to successfully make the trip. Seaplanes were all the rage. If you're in the Coast Guard, it makes sense to have a plane that can land, fly out, find the distressed people, land next to them, and help them out. The first Coast Guard air station opened in Morehead City, North Carolina, with 6 HS-2L flying boats, which they borrowed from the Navy, seen on the upper right. And the Coast Guard continued to use amphibious aircraft until 1983, when the last of the HU-16s were phased out. Well before that, it had been realized that it really wasn't necessary to land the plane in the water to assist the people below. They effected ways to airdrop equipment, pumps, life rafts, whatever else was needed. And in fact, to land an amphibious plane in a storm was pretty much a one-way trip. So these were gradually phased out. But another mission that the Coast Guard picked up was the International Ice Patrol. April 15th, 1912, that IC ship met an iceberg with disastrous results, and there was a clamor. So for the 1913 ice season, the Revenue Cutter Service was ordered to patrol the ice zone. The Revenue Cutter Seneca and the Revenue Cutter Miami were assigned to those duties. Interestingly, the Seneca, which is shown in the bottom left, was actually built as a derelict destroyer. She had a very strong hull so that if there were an abandoned ship floating around as posing a threat to navigation, maybe a partially sunken ship, they could simply ram the heck out of it until it sank. So she was a sturdy ship and as well suited as anything there was for the ice patrol. In 1914, an international agreement established the International Ice Patrol, but that International Ice Patrol was in fact staffed and operated for many years by the United States Coast Guard, funded by the signatory agency or nations. The International Ice Patrol was established, and we see that after a while, it really wasn't necessary to keep ships on station. Again, we found that airplanes can do things that ships can't. The International Ice Patrol is still in effect. There are Coast Guard aircraft operating, I think, out of Argentia, Newfoundland during the ice season that periodically do flyovers, assisted, of course, by satellite observation and all kinds of other inputs. Well, the Coast Guard comes of age. January 28, 1915, 14 U.S.C. 1 established the United States Coast Guard as an organization, merged the Revenue Cutter Service finally with the Life Saving Service, and these were the two initial mainstays of the Coast Guard. And that law reaffirmed that the Coast Guard, as established on that date, shall be a military service and a branch of the armed forces of the United States at all times. And we see that famous Revenue Cutter Service Ensign on the bottom left, and this evolved into the Coast Guard Ensign, which has not changed in over 100 years. World War I, again, the Revenue Cutter Service, all the major cutters were taken under naval operational control. The Coast Guard cutter Tampa was sunk while convoy escort with the loss of all hands, unfortunately, but it was the largest, highest single American casualty loss in that war on the naval side. New duties. Well, 1920s, we have Prohibition. And that, again, is the stimulus for new equipment. We have shown on the top right, I think one of my favorite classes of Coast Guard cutters, the 125-foot patrol boats, which were called buck and a quarters. And these were some fairly sturdy boats with some pretty good speed for the time, very seaworthy. And they were used as one of the elements for enforcement of prohibition laws. In 1939, the Lighthouse service, that first service established by the federal government, was finally absorbed into the Coast Guard. And in 1940, the Coast Guard was assigned responsibility for ocean stations, which the cuttermen fondly referred to as 44,100 square miles of bad weather. Basically, they would go out into an assigned spot in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean and sit there for 3 months. And they had to be basically in a 10-mile square in the middle of that area, unless they were called out for other duties. And they were there come hell or high water. We see a 327-foot Coast Guard cutter on ocean station on the bottom right. And that gives you an idea of what it might have been like to be on that ship in moderate weather, let alone severe weather. Well, in February 1942, the Bureau of Marine Inspection Navigation, the organization that had been established to license seamen, inspect and license ships, duties along those lines, was merged with the Coast Guard to give it its final big extra organizational input. In World War II, the Coast Guard served very honorably. In fact, starting on December 7th of 1941, the Coast Guard cutter Taney and several smaller vessels in Pearl Harbor were very busy that day, firing everything they had at the Japanese planes. A couple of lesser known things, beach patrols. We have shown on the right, again, we have life-saving stations all up and down the coast, Coast Guard stations. These are observation points. They are central points from which to warm and feed and deploy people who could patrol the beaches. In some cases, they used dogs. In other cases, shown on the bottom right, a crew from a New Jersey station, happens to be an all African-American crew on horseback. They used whatever they had to patrol the beaches, and there's at least one incident where a Coast Guard beach patrol intercepted landing parties from a German submarine with large quantities of explosives. Douglas Monroe, the only Coast Guardsman ever to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was at Guadalcanal, and he was conveying Marines ashore. And when the Marines met stiff resistance and had large numbers of casualties, he took his boat back up as close to the shore as he could and started evacuating the casualties. He made 5 trips under serious fire before he was eventually killed. But again, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. But Guadalcanal was an early case of amphibious operations, D-Day, of course, being the biggest and grandest. And on D-Day, there were Coast Guardmen, primarily the men who were familiar with operating the small boats at the coastal stations, who were the coxswains on many of the landing craft on D-Day. There were also Coast Guard cutters, slightly bigger, just offshore the landing area, providing search and rescue duties. For example, if a landing craft were hit and sunk, they were available for that. Well, the next war, well, the Coast Guard, I should say, was involved to a degree in the Korean War, but that was largely not a naval war in any case. In Vietnam, WHEC's high endurance cutters, seen on the right, a 327-foot cutter, provided naval gunfire support to people on shore. A squadron of 17 80-foot patrol boats was deployed to Vietnam for inshore, close to the beach patrols, where they were primarily engaged in intercepting Vietnamese sampans that might have been smuggling goods. So we see that. There was an interesting development at the bottom left there. The Coast Guard just before this had developed a dual gun, which is an 81 millimeter mortar with a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on top of it, because there just wasn't dual space to give each one its own room. But these cutters were pretty well armed considering. There was an incident involving the cutter Point Welcome, in which the United States Air Force, 3 planes bravely took on the Point Welcome. In the course of the interchange, they fired rockets, cluster bombs, and 1,100 rounds of ammunition. They didn't succeed in sinking the Point Welcome, but they did kill 2 crew members and injure several others. Subsequently to that, people wisely decided it might be good to teach the Air Force people what Coast Guard cutters look like. And some last minute things. In 1967, the Coast Guard was transferred to the Department of Transportation when that department was created. 1972, they assumed duties under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, various other acts, 1977 Clean Water Act, 1976 offshore fisheries to patrol the areas offshore to ensure that fisheries regulations are being enforced. 1980s, we got involved in the drug war at sea. The picture on the lower right, incidentally, is a picture of the tanker Corinthos burning at the pier in the Delaware River. It was a large crude oil carrier who was rammed by a chemical carrier, the Queenie, which was busy trying to turn around and not paying attention to where they were going. It released oil, caused a spill about 50 miles long on the Delaware River. I happen to know about that because I was there in charge of the people who were responding. In 1983, the concept of a maritime defense zone was introduced. In 1975, the Navy had done away with its last inward-looking organization, the Naval Sea Frontiers, which were basically the folks that historically had been charged with homeland security. The Maritime Defense Zones was a joint Navy Coast Guard command, still exists, but they're basically shadow commands to be stood up in time of war. But their purpose was to plan for, coordinate the operations of, gee whiz, all those things that my great-grandfather was doing in 1898, bringing together the Coast Guard, Naval Reserve, Army Reserve Forces, anybody who was going to be operating in and around the ports. And just a little bit of historical irony, the officer who was assigned as the plans officer for Maritime Defense Zone Pacific happened to be me. So I was redoing the work that my grandfather had done 85 years earlier. In 1990, 1991, the Gulf War, the Coast Guard was actively involved. They had forward deployed units providing security in the theater, but also heavily involved in providing security for the materials being outloaded from US ports. And we have the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11. And one of the core elements of that was the Coast Guard transferred from the Department of Transportation. Coast Guard missions today are shown here. It's really a aggregation of everything that they've been doing and gathering under their wing for many years. And the red ones on this list are those that were actually listed as Homeland Security specific missions. Coast Guard resources today, it's grown from 10 ships with 10 men each to 87,000 people. That's 41,000 active duty, 7,000 ready reservists, about 8,500 civilians, and 31,000 Coast Guard auxiliaries. Those are volunteers who basically enforce boating safety laws, doing vessel inspections, education to boaters. And we have 243 cutters. We see the Polar Sea, an icebreaker. We see 154-foot national security boat, buoy tender on the bottom, a little bit of everything. So we've got 243 cutters. We've got 1,650 boats roughly. That 47-footer I showed you earlier, looking very calm. This is it at the entrance to Oregon Inlet on the West Coast, taking a moderate-sized wave. These boats are actually designed to operate in hurricane-force winds and 20-foot seas, and they are also capable of, if they happen to accidentally roll over, righting themselves within 10 seconds. A variety of other vessels for rescue and security work. And of course, the airplanes, we've got about 260 fixed-wing aircraft, the intermediate range twin propeller, the C-130s, kind of venerable, but they've been upgraded many times. 140 helicopters, HH-60, bottom left is kind of the veteran, the HH-65, a newer helicopter on the right. And interestingly, that one is painted orange. That's what they do with helicopters that are deployed on icebreakers, so that should they happen to have a mishap in the ice, they'll be very easy to find. And so we have Hamilton's legacy of frugality, and a popular saying, which I've since learned doesn't apply just to the Coast Guard, but we've done so much for so long with so little that soon we'll be able to do everything with nothing. Fortunately, we're not there yet because there have been some really good assets added to the Coast Guard in the last few years. But that's what I have for you today. And I guess now we can take any questions. I can endeavor to answer to the best of my ability. Am I standing alone here?
No questions as of yet.
That must mean that I covered everything absolutely brilliantly, which is good because I said everything I know.
We have one question from Brian. Do you know the status of the USGC Museum?
Say that again now.
Do you know the status of the USGC Museum? I wonder if they mean
U.S. Coast Guard. I think that's a typo, but the Coast Guard Museum, which is being built in New London, Connecticut, a lot of it has been built. I understand they're still working on fundraising to finish paying for it. It's going to be a darn impressive facility when it's open. And I'm not sure what the timeline is, but I'm thinking it's within the next year or so. Meanwhile, you just have to come to the Mariners Museum.
We have another question. Can you speak as K to the Fresnel lens collection at the Training Center, Yorktown?
Yes, the Training Center in Yorktown, where they teach aids to navigation, has a really good collection of, actually pronounced Fresnel lenses. I think they have at least one of each order from the smallest to the biggest. We have a very fine collection of them here at the museum, of which only one happens to be on display. But yes, the Coast Guard Training Center in Yorktown, when they are probably finished with COVID, they have a very good display of lighthouse lenses, buoys, and everything else pertaining to aids to navigation, which I recommend highly once they're reopened.
All right, and we have, looks like one more question. Do you have, from Mark, do you have any more information about Captain of the Surveyor, Sam Travis?
I have some, but I don't have it with me. I can point Mark to the reference that I have if we have his contact information.
All right, that would not be I would not be the person for that. I don't know how to get that.
Let me just say at this time, if you noticed in the beginning of my presentation, there were a lot of things that were sort of question marky, like maybe this ship had 2 masts and maybe it had 1, and maybe it had cannons and maybe it didn't, and maybe. This is largely because of 2 things. First, the decentralized administration for many years. Most of the records were kept locally with no requirements as to how long or where they would be maintained. Those that were kept in Washington, D.C., there were some unfriendly people in the War of 1812 who basically burned the Capitol and a lot of the records that were there. And then in 1833, the Treasury Department had a really bad fire. So a lot of the early records actually held by the government are long gone. So the information that's available is having to be gathered from secondary sources of a wide variety.
All right. We have another question from Margaret. Could you speak a little about the Boston area Coast Guard?
No. I honestly, there's a good presence of the Coast Guard in Boston. The 1st Coast Guard District headquarters is there. There are a number of cutters stationed there, support facilities, but I don't know those in detail, especially since, to tell the truth, I've been retired from the Coast Guard longer than I was on active duty, which was only 25 years. So I would have to refer her to any of a large number of other sources for more detailed information, and I apologize. You can ask me about Norfolk, though. I can talk about Tidewater.
We have one question in the chat box. What from William? What shortages could the U.S. Coast Guard use budget help with?
Everything. And again, I'm not up on exactly what current appropriations have been for the last few years. I know that there have been substantial appropriations to build things like the 418-foot Legend class cutters, which are built with national defense as a significant built-in capacity. There are several new classes of cutters which have come online and are coming online. But the Coast Guard is always challenged in terms of having the resources to do all of its jobs 100%. But truthfully, I don't have an answer to that question.
All right, and we have another question in the chat box from Noel. You noted the biggest difference between the U.S. Coast Guard and the other branches of the service is that the U.S. Coast Guard has law enforcement responsibilities. Could you speak more about how posse
comitatus.
that does not apply, or how it is different with the U.S. Coast Guard?
Well, Posse Comitatus Act basically said that the U.S. Army couldn't enforce domestic regulations. It couldn't be a law enforcement agency. We didn't want to get to the British in 1775. So that forbade the Army and from doing it, and by inference, the Navy and Marine Corps and subsequently Air Force have been included under that umbrella. Exceptions can be made, but that's a general rule. However, the Coast Guard wears 2 hats, so that even when the Coast Guard is operating under the Department of Defense, it still has its civilian law enforcement responsibilities, and Coast Guardsmen can, wearing their Coast Guard hat, still act as federal law enforcement officers in any way that's necessary. For example, one thing that's been done, naval ships deployed in the Persian Gulf to stop piracy and other things going on there, frequently carry with them a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment of 6 or 8 people. If they detect a ship that they need to board and investigate, the Navy ship will help the Coast Guard people get into the water. The Coast Guard people will then go perform the law enforcement functions that they are authorized to do. And when they're finished with that, they will come back to the Navy, who thoughtfully provides them with transportation and bed and breakfast.
All right. We got another question from MST. Can you share some things about the Norfolk Coast Guard?
The Norfolk Coast Guard? That I can do. In the local area here, there is a Coast Guard facility. There's a port center. It's actually in Portsmouth, which is a very large facility that has research and development facilities, training facilities, but largely designed to support cutters. There are a number of cutters which are home ported there. In Little Creek, we have a Coast Guard station, kind of the remnants of the old life-saving service. There's a Coast Guard air station in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which provides service for a large radius, north and south. To a large degree, not a large degree, but to a significant extent, the Coast Guard stations along the coast are much further apart now than they once were, partly because the boats are more capable, but more specifically because of the ability of airplanes to get to the scene quickly, more quickly, and provide initial assistance as necessary. But there's a large Coast Guard presence. Oh yeah, in downtown Portsmouth, the Commander Coast Guard Atlantic area, who is also the commander of the Maritime Defense Zone Atlantic. So this is one of the largest concentrations of Coast Guardsmen in the country. Of course, not too far from here at Yorktown, we have the Coast Guard Training Center. So there's a lot of Coast Guard in this area.
A lot of military in this area in general.
Well, yes, there is.
And it looks like that's about it with the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the stream off. But
Okay.
to everyone watching, thanks very much.
Let me just say Happy Coast Guards Day again. Celebrate it appropriately.
All righty then. Y'all have a good afternoon.